Good evening. Welcome to Santa Clara University, the Jesuit University in Silicon Valley. I'm Lisa Kloppenberg, Dean of the Law School and Interim Provost-elect. Santa Clara is in the middle of a capital campaign to raise $1 billion for new endeavors and to better support our students, not only in what they will do and the world they will help create, but in who they will become. Our theme is innovating with a mission, and as a Jesuit university, right at the heart of our mission is the importance of the human person in all her dimensions. The flourishing of all people, and especially those at the margins, is a core concern in our calling to make the world more just and humane. On campus and beyond, human flourishing inspires the work of the Ignatian Center, which is hosting this event, and our other centers of distinction and constituent schools. The depth and breadth of the scholarly insights from Europe, Asia, and the US that we've hosted over the last 2 days of meetings has been truly impressive. This type of intellectual and intercultural exchange is at the heart of what Santa Clara is about as a Jesuit university in what is the world's largest center of information exchange, Silicon Valley. It's been a delight to partner with the China Forum for Civilizational Dialogue, a project sponsored by Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and La Civiltà Cattolica in Rome, and the Pontifical Council for Culture. I would especially like to recognize Father Antonio Spadaro, the editor-in-chief of La Civiltà Cattolica and an advisor to the Pontifical Council for Culture, Bishop Paul Tai, one of today's panelists and the secretary of the Pontifical Council for Culture, and Thomas Banchoff, our moderator today, who is the vice president for global engagement at Georgetown University and professor in the Department of Government and Walsh School of Foreign Service. We all look forward to the panel conversation this evening, but also the new conversation that will emerge from this event and shape our planet's future. Thank you all. Shia Shia. Now, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Dorian Llewellyn of the Society of Jesus, the executive director of our wonderful Ignatian Center of Jesuit Education. Father Dorian.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The latest project of the Ignatian Center is called Tech and the Human Spirit. It's an exploration of the impact of technology on all aspects of what it is to be human, including the spiritual. Our endeavor is not so much about what tech can do or what it should do, but rather who we are and who we are becoming in a tech-shaped world. This is our particular contribution to Santa Clara University's Innovating with a Mission. The questions that people ask about human meaning and human dignity and human rights that are emerging in the wake of technology's advance are urgent, and there is increasing awareness and interest in the many topics. The questions do not ask for quick, easy fixes like a software patch. What they require is thoughtful, wide-ranging conversation with many, many different partners, different perspectives from different contexts. So today we are delighted to welcome you into what has been an ongoing conversation, the seminar on AI and the human person, Chinese and Western perspectives. So I'd like to welcome to the stage our panelists. You've heard Dean Kloppenberg's introduction of Tom Banchoff and also Bishop Paul Tai. Let me tell you a little bit more about Dr. Banchoff. Previously, he was the founding director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. He's published widely on religion, ethics, and world politics. Over on the far end, we have Professor Daniel Bell, who is Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University. He is the author of the books The China Model and The Spirit of Cities, co-authored with Avner de Chalit. And he's the founding editor of the Princeton China series. And last year, he was awarded the Huilin Prize and honored as a cultural leader by the World Economic Forum. Next to Tom here is Sorhun Tang. She is professor of philosophy at Singapore Management University. Previously, she taught at the National University of Singapore. Professor Tan is an expert on comparative moral and political philosophy between the Chinese and Western traditions. Her work explores the confluences of Confucianism, Deweyan pragmatism, and Chinese democracy. Bishop Paul Tai is, as we heard, the Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Culture. He previously served as Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Social Communications. He has been a leading figure in recent Vatican efforts to address artificial intelligence and other sociological developments through activities such as the Pontifical Council for Culture's 2017 plenary session, The Future of Humanity, New Challenges to Anthropology. And finally, I welcome my former colleague, Professor Robin Wang, who is Robert H. Taylor Chair in Philosophy and Director of the Asian Pacific Studies Program at Loyola Marymount University. She is a recent Berggruen Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. She's a specialist in Chinese thought and its evolution in this age of globalization. Currently, she is working on a project on Chinese philosophy, particularly Taoism, as it relates to the challenges and opportunities posed by artificial intelligence. This is a particularly distinguished panel. I've enjoyed their conversations tremendously. I know that you will too, so please join me in warmly welcoming our distinguished panel.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you, Father Dorian, for that warm welcome. Thank you all for coming out on a Friday afternoon. This is for us, as was mentioned, the culmination of 2 days together, intensively discussing some issues which we know will be of interest to our wider societies for many decades to come. So it's an exciting moment. And I thought before launching into the panel discussion, I'd give you a little more context about how we all got here, what our topics have been, and what the goals are for this seminar and the wider project of which it's a part. As was mentioned, Georgetown and La Civiltà Cattolica, two Jesuit institutions, started something called the China Forum for Civilizational Dialogue last year. This is part of our effort to contribute to dialogue across civilizations on matters of critical importance to humanity. Those of you who know your history, and since we're at a Jesuit institution, I think many will be aware that the Society of Jesus, since the time of Matteo Ricci in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, has been engaged actively in dialogue with China in an effort, of course, to spread the gospel, but also to listen and to learn, to find points of commonality in a spirit of mutual respect. And so this project, the China Forum, our gathering here today, is very much in that spirit. The forum has 3 topics, all designed to identify areas of commonality between China and the world, areas that are, of course, political, because we can't avoid that, but really have a strong cultural and societal dimension, and therefore are open to constructive engagement and communication. One of the topics is the future of humanities education, which is a concern around the world as we move into more technological society. Another is the future of ecological civilization. We've had interesting dialogues on that, obviously a critical issue in light of the threat of climate change. And the third, as you know, is AI with a focus on the human person. And what we've done is engage this topic not so much as AI experts, but as scholars of different religious and philosophical traditions, trying to come to terms with these emergent challenges we're all familiar with, revolutions in machine learning that are ongoing, the ability of machines to manipulate words, data, and images, implications, of course, for all kinds of sectors of our society: transportation, communications, business law, medicine, you name it. We're not going to tackle, we haven't tried to tackle all of that. Given where we're coming from, given our disciplinary backgrounds, we want to focus in, zero in on this question of the human person. What does the growing presence of machine-human interaction across all of these domains, what does it mean for how we think of ourselves as human beings and how we relate to other human beings? I don't have to tell you that we're going through a transformation where, if you look around here on campus, obviously, at the dinner table, public transportation, people are fully immersed more than ever with their digital assistants, with their cell phones. They are interacting in a more individualized, personalized way, thanks to AI, which is shaping our view of what reality is, reacting to our needs and preferences, and also shaping those preferences in turn. It's partly that interaction, which raises interesting philosophical, ethical, and moral questions, but it's partly also just the fact of that interaction and the time that we're spending, not in face-to-face interaction with other human beings, but with our digital worlds. It's probably not going to change, so it's a good opportunity to think about not just the challenges that this poses to our traditional understanding of the human person, but maybe in an optimistic vein, some of the ways in which these new technologies can reinforce and strengthen some of the wisdom across the traditions about what a human person is. And of course, there are many different points of view. You'll be hearing some of them, but one of the things that came out of our discussion so far, and I hope you'll see this as a theme here on the panel, is a certain degree of, if not commonality, convergence around a certain idea of the human person. Not the human person that we're familiar with from our wider culture, the world of technology and business, with its focus on the individual, the autonomous individual, rational, making choices, determining his or her own future. An idea of a human person which resonates particularly in the United States, but of course has spread around the world. What we find in Catholic social thought, but as you'll hear also in Confucianism and in other traditions, is much more a focus on the relational. The idea that you can't even think the individual without thinking and understanding and appreciating the bonds of codependence, of relationality that we're born into, and that imply not just freedoms, but also duties and responsibilities. So that's one theme that has emerged. Another theme that we focused on is the importance of the body and our embodied nature as human beings. Again, you'll see, understood in different ways across traditions between Christianity and Chinese philosophy, but fundamentally a skepticism of the notion that there's the mind and then there's the body, that you can engage with people in the same way across distances, digitally or in virtual worlds. There's a sense, I think, within our traditions, which of course developed without these technologies in worlds that were, of course, interpersonal in a very physical sense, that the body and our physical selves are critical in thinking about the sense of what it is to be a human person and the implications of these technologies for our changing relationships with ourselves and with others. So I wanted to preview for you a little bit some of the themes we'll be touching on, give you a sense of the conversation. We have touched on other things, and there'll be plenty of time for conversation with you, but we wanted to provide a unique space to look at some issues, not as AI experts, but as people embedded in these traditions, concerned about, hopeful about, but also concerned about the trajectory of these technologies in our world. So with that, I'm going to hold back. Each of the speakers will maybe say a little bit more about their background and interest in the topic, and then speak for maybe 5 to 7 minutes with some reflections. I'm not going to preview anymore, but give them a chance to lay out some of their ideas. Then we'll have a short conversation here on the panel, and we'll open it up to you. And stick around to the end because we have a reception as well. Okay? It's Friday afternoon. All right. With that, I want to hand it over to my colleague, Sir Hun.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very new to this topic of AI, but I consider it an important issue for certainly people interested in Confucianism, whether political philosophy or ethics, to grapple with. So what I'm going to share are just some questions and concerns, because I haven't done enough serious research to have any kind of definitive thesis to defend or to present to you. So I'll start with the contrast that Tom has already touched on, which is the different views of the human person, right? So AI has made tremendous progress on the basis of a certain view of human thinking and acting that privileges autonomy and reason, as conceived by in the European Enlightenment, right? This particular model of human reasoning on autonomy is one that basically drives a wedge between reason and on the one hand and feelings and emotion on the other, as well as between mind and body. But this kind of dualism and accompanying neglect of feelings and the body is not shared by the Confucian tradition. For Confucians, the human person is fundamentally relational. This doesn't just mean that relationships are important to us. It actually means that there is no human person without human relations. The human relations actually constitute our persons. So the human person is not born as a complete human person. For Confucians, the human person has to be cultivated. So the self-cultivation that produces the ideal human person is one that cannot omit the body. So self-cultivation is at the same time cultivation of the body. Right? So the person and the body are not separate. Person is always embodied. So this already gives a very different understanding of what it would mean to actually think and act like a human being. Right? So it immediately raises some skepticism of whether it's possible for AI to ever think and act like human beings from the Confucian perspective of the human person. Okay, or at least some pretty drastic modification to the approach and their model of the human person would have to take place before Confucians would be willing to admit that AI can think and act like a human person. Now, the kind of model that AI operates on may not matter so much even to Confucians, insofar as AI is limited to the kind of domains where we are basically looking for new and better ways of meeting functional goals, right? Because all these functional goals, how to achieve them, could be done better by AI, right, through algorithms. But because of the different view of human persons in Confucianism, their view of human relationship is also very different. So when AI enters the kind of domain where human interactions is of primary importance, for example, in education, right? The interaction between teacher and student is absolutely important to the achievement of educational goals, or in the domain of elder care, for example, right? Where the caring relation, again, the human interaction is very important. And if that's the case, then what is distinctively human about human interactions? Is it just a matter of meeting certain needs or certain desires, right? That the person being educated or the person being cared for has, right? Is meeting these kinds of needs and desires something that can be met through some kind of algorithm? From the Confucian perspective, that's not possible. Simply because what is really human about these interactions, there are two components. One is empathy, and one is reciprocity. And when it comes to empathy, the understanding of empathy is it's just a kind of emotion, and it's the kind of emotion that has a embodied aspect, so that the biological substrate, the kind of organism that we are, right, that operates in a certain kind of natural as well as social environment, is absolutely crucial to developing that kind of empathy. So insofar as AI cannot have our kind of experience, the kind of experience of human beings, right, because they don't have the same kind of biological substrate, it would be a problem to expect AI to have that kind of empathy. And reciprocity, again, is dependent on, is between human beings with comparable experience because of the kind of biological organism that they are and because of their shared environment, right? They have comparable experience, never exactly the same, but comparable in the way that we could empathize with the other, right? And the reciprocity involves paying attention to the particularity of the other person, as well as responding to them through one's own particularity. Right? So these are some of the, I think, concerns that Confucians would have and would like to see, not so much that they will resist any more progress in AI, but rather would like to see the development of AI perhaps shifting in this direction, or at least broadening its attention to what needs to be factored in terms of the next stage of progress. I think that's all.
Thank you, Paul.
Great. Just like to say, I want to share a few ideas that are coming. This is an area, AI, which has extraordinary potential for our future, and also we're becoming aware of certain risks. And I think the Church is concerned to reflect on it, to think about it, but it's an emerging reflection. There are no definitive Church teachings in this area yet. I think we need to study, understand what's happening, and engage, because this is going to be truly a global issue. It's not an issue just for one church or for one ethical tradition or one culture. And that's one of the challenges, because the work in the area of AI is happening across the globe. And even where it's happening locally, it tends to be globalized workforces who are coming together to do that. So there's different value systems, different approaches at play. And I think it's an interesting challenge for us. My interest first is, as somebody who taught about ethics and taught ethics for many years, I think I'm delighted to see the currency of the word ethics is back. People are talking about it and concerned about it. And that's, for me, positive. I think one thing we have to be very careful, as maybe people who are professional ethicists or who have worked in that area, is that we don't disempower the people who are at the center of the development, the people who are doing the work, the people who really know the technologies, that we can help them, but we can't allow them to outsource the ethics. They're the ones who understand the issues. They're the ones who will be making the decisions. They're the ones who I think we can help to reflect more critically and offer them a vocabulary and offer them systems that will help them to think ethically. But I think we have to be careful not to be involved in any form of disempowering. I think I welcome, as you read all over the place, there's different projects which will all put human at the center. You know, ethics, we want our AI to be human-centered, at the service of humanity. We want it to be person-centered. We want it to be for good. I think that's very welcome. I think people who work in the area of ethics will be very conscious that it's easier to name the criteria of being human than it is to fully work out and understand what it is to be human and what it is that makes human life worthwhile, and that has been expressed differently in different cultures. So we have to be much more attentive of that. However, I remain convinced that our own Catholic Christian ethical tradition, which says that one way of reflecting and thinking about ethical issues is to ask the question, what are the values and what are the ideas and what are the approaches that will encourage and help human beings to flourish as individuals and in society? What will be the impact of the type of decisions we may be making on the long-term future of human beings, and thinking of human beings not just as isolated individuals, but as people who live in community together? I think that tradition, which we have called it down the natural moral law tradition, which is based on a conviction that there is something distinctive and given about being human that is worth encouraging, can be a starting point. I mean, it's not without its problems, and it needs to be nuanced because we have to do this in a more globalized capacity. I think in that context too, I think sometimes it's easier within our Western tradition at least to start with human rights. Human rights, in a sense, are articulations of things that we see that are intrinsic or important to human dignity, to the value and worth of human people, that enable people to flourish when they live together in society. So I think there's rich ground there to work together. I think as an ethicist, I want to say one thing that I want to watch. Sometimes I think we have to watch sometimes when we're thinking about ethics. There's an ethical theory which is kind of about more utilitarian or consequentialist, which says we try and see the consequences of what we do and we measure the consequences. And I think it looks robustly scientific. But those of us who have maybe studied or have the opportunity of studying more philosophically know the limitations of such a system, that not all consequences are the same. Not all consequences are predictable. So that approach isn't necessarily the only way of doing ethics. I think it has much to teach us and much to contribute, but be careful of just going with that one approach, particularly because it looks scientific and it may be a first starting point. I think also we need to ask questions which are about virtue ethics and about conscience. What sort of person do I want to be? I am making certain choices in my work that have consequences, but they also affect who I am. They shape the type of person I am. And I think one of the more interesting ethical developments has been where people as individuals have refused to do certain type of research, even though their refusal to do it may have a cost for them, may not be overly effective insofar as other people will come along and fill those jobs. But I think it serves as a warning and an invitation to us to think more ethically. From a Catholic perspective, I think these are just very tentative insights I'd want to offer that I think from our tradition are important. One is, as a Catholic tradition, we've often studied with reconciling well the idea that as human beings we are mind and body. We've suffered sometimes from a more dualistic approach, and that's not unique to us. I think we have to watch in some of the advanced thinking or the limit thinking about the future of humanity and the singularity and moving on to, there's a slight tendency at times to think that the distinctively and uniquely human is our rational capacity, is our mind, and maybe not giving enough attentiveness to what it is to be bodily. And particularly as contemporary science will show us, the bodily and material functions are at the basis of many of our, what we would have thought more our conscious activities. Related to that, just reiterate the importance of the social dimension. Pope Francis, in his first tentative effort to address this, his letter is called On Human Community. That we are not isolated individuals who make a compromise to find a way of living together socially. We are born into communities, we're born into families, we are social in our essence, and we have to keep that alive. Something about the dignity of all human beings. Then finally, just a tendency at times when we think and talk about technology, our Catholic tradition has wanted to say and celebrate the goodness of technology and science, the gifts it has brought to us in so many ways. We've also been aware of sometimes what we call the dual use. We can use technology for good, we can use it for bad. I see emerging recently a thing that says, but technology isn't always just neutral. Technology, and particularly the products or applications of technology and science, tend to be developed within certain value systems. They're developed within an economic and political context where that may determine how they play out. So in an environment where the emphasis is on competition, being the first to get there, being the ones to maximize the profit, that can affect how the technologies are developed and so they're not quite as neutral as we might want. One other thing that I would just think is important is that we live in a world that's already marked by gross inequalities. The risk that the development of AI, by concentrating wealth in increasingly fewer hands, could exacerbate those inequalities, not just economically, but also democratically. Who will have the bigger say? Because we can shop for jurisdictions, we can lobby, we can have power. And even almost a final question of, we tend to talk about in the Christian tradition, creation, God made human beings in his own image and likeness. As human beings begin to create artificial intelligence, whose images and likenesses will be prioritized? Whose notion of what it is to be human will dominate? And how do we ensure that there is an inclusive approach to looking at these? Thank you.
Thank you. Robin?
My name is Robin Wang. I'm from Loyola Marymount University. And we see it's University of Silicon Beach. This is our president trying branding our university. But I'm supposed to bring into Taoist perspective into this dialogue. Taoism is less taught or less researched in academic field, but very much into the popular culture. If people have never been to China, they think about the Chinese culture usually is Great Wall, Kung Fu, and the Kung Pao chicken. So therefore, but do you know actually Kung Fu and culinary arts, somewhat very much rooted in Taoist teaching. So I will see Taoism is a nature-inspired practice and theory and practice. So nature gave them inspirations for human beings to emulate. So in terms of AI, when we look at the Taoist perspective into AI, so I'm asking the question, can machine flow like Tao? Okay, this is my question. Why I'm asking this question? Then because this is, instead, we're not thinking about, just like Father talking about the human beings is a thinking being. But for Taoist ideas, every existence, including human beings, is a qi flow beings. Qi is energy, right? So, so therefore, in this kind of, so you are not really eating a food, but rather you are eating a qi. Are you taking the qi? And the qi can be quantified. And so therefore, in certain way, machine can flow like a Tao because its machine can flow like qi. There is a qi flowing. However, so because in Chinese history, Taoist practitioner is like a qi engineering because they understand the body in the 12 qi channels called the Jingle. So, however, so this is only one simple, quick readings. But then if we deep reading Taoist view, thinking about human beings. Human beings are much more and also beyond a qi, just the simple qi flow. Because human being consists of 3 elements. One is the physical forms. It's male, female, these biological forms. Secondly, we talk about this qi, it's energy flow. But the third is a spirit, it's a shen. So this spirit, this shen, is translated, you can see, mystical force, the power. Right? So in this kind of situation, so then we're looking about the shen from 3 different aspects. So we can see shen, it's clarity, shen ming, you see things with the perspective very clear. And then secondly, we see shen qi is all your embodiment of this qi, your character. And then also shen ling is the shen spirit. When you die, you have 2 types of spirit, hun and po. So this is basic Taoist view to think about the human beings. It's not dualistic, but rather from a more complicated way to capture the human existence. Now, come to the AI. So what we should do about the AI then? There's 2 distinctions needed to be made. So one distinction will be natural intelligence and artificial stupidity. So the idea is we always embodied a certain kind of inborn nature. And this inborn nature, we need to preserve it. But we should not use our stupidity, fake intelligence, destroy our inborn nature. So this is very classical text that always talk about very much how can we make our effort to preserve our genuine inborn nature. So make a distinction between what is a human nature and what is a heavenly nature. And do not use the heavenly nature do not use the human nature to interfere heavenly nature. So this is one distinction. Then secondly, following that distinction, building on that distinction, then we see what is our ultimate pursuit. So ultimate pursuit is to pursue genuineness, children, so authenticity, loosely translate. This is not, and then not simply satisfying human desire. So human desire is, in many cases, is dangerous, destructive. So in this kind of distinctions, we can have our pursuit, but then the purpose of the pursuit become genuine the person, which is 真人 in Taoist pursuit, not just simply satisfy all your artificial wants and desires. So I think this is the way, Taoist Taoist perspective on this AI issue. Another thing I think maybe Taoist perspective can make contributions to artificial intelligence AI field, which I call the yin-yang intelligence, where you probably know the yin-yang symbols, half black, half white. Then most important thing is yin-yang symbol is this is not a circle, it's a floating S. So you are making adaptive choices, and you see yourself how to, not just yourself, but also AI can make alignment with your environment, with the situation. Okay, so that's all.
Thank you. Daniel?
So thank you. I've participated in dialogues the past couple of days. It's been fascinating. And I think pretty much we agree that AI can be good or bad. So we really have to think about what standards we should use to evaluate whether AI can be used for desirable purposes or not. And the Chinese traditions, I think, have a lot to offer. But before I begin, I just want to ask a question to everybody here. I want you to imagine a future 50 years from now, a very wealthy society, all our basic needs are met, and advanced machinery would do all the socially necessary work that we wouldn't otherwise want to do. Boring, repetitive, dirty labor. Advanced machinery would do all that work, and then we would be free to develop our creative talents. How many of you think of that as a positive vision of the future? Can you raise your hand? Okay, so most people here are communists. Because what I described is Karl Marx's vision of a higher communist society. So the word communist sounds kind of bad because it's been misused, in much of the world over the past 100 years. But Karl Marx had a very beautiful vision of the future, which is the one that I just described, where human beings are free to develop their creative talents because advanced machinery does a socially necessary work. And at the time, it sounded quite utopian, but now, with the development of AI, it is a possible future that we can imagine, right? We can imagine a future where AI does the work that we wouldn't otherwise want to do, the boring, repetitive, and dangerous forms of labor. And then all humans would be free to develop our capacity for creative work, which not everybody has this deep need, but at least among many of us, right, in the university and sectors, for example, we do think that a good kind of form of life is one that involves the capacity for creative work. So here's a good standard to judge what's positive and what's negative about AI. If AI can help us move towards this future where we have free time and resources that allow us to develop our capacity for creative work, then it's good. If it inhibits that capacity for creative work, then it's bad. So the Marxist tradition in China is coming back, and it's not necessarily a bad thing if it helps us to think about AI in this way. My colleagues have already described the Confucian tradition, which offers a somewhat contrasting or maybe complementary vision of the good life. I mean, for Confucians, as was just mentioned, the good life lies in our relations with other people, starting with our family members and extending to other people. And if AI can help us to nourish those relations with family members and with other members of society, with our intimates, and with strangers too, and with animals and with the natural world, if AI helps us to nourish harmonious social relations, then it should be encouraged. But if AI hinders that capacity, then it should be discouraged. So again, it's a simple idea that what standards should we use to evaluate whether AI is a good or bad thing? I think both the Marxist and the Confucian traditions provide helpful answers. For the Marxist tradition, it's positive if it helps us to free us from the need to engage in unwanted labor and gives us free time and resources to develop our capacity for creative work. And for Confucians, it's good if it helps us to nourish our valued social ties and promote harmonious social relations in family at large. And there's lots of examples that we can use to develop these ideas. I think our moderator will push us in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So you've gotten a taste of the conversation, which, by the way, over the last day and a half has involved about a dozen colleagues who are here today and who may jump in when we get to questions and answers. But before we do that, I wanted to give a couple specific examples of technologies that are emerging, driven by AI, that challenge us in traditional areas of life across our societies, and focus first on the process of education. The value of education, of self-cultivation. Sorhun mentioned it in the Confucian tradition, not just as accumulation of knowledge, but a moral education. And in Christian tradition, we sometimes talk about formation. How is that educational enterprise already being transformed, will be transformed by the evolution of new technologies? I'm thinking here in particular of personalized AI tutors, which are already being developed at different levels of education, and one could argue are a very positive development, because by observing the student in real time, understanding where they're struggling, obviously evaluating their accumulation of knowledge, but also reading their emotional responses to the material, such tutors, not necessarily now, but in the future, will be able to customize the educational experience, provide encouragement. One could even argue, and this is maybe a bit of a stretch, that on the moral side, the use of multimedia and narratives and stories, and challenging students to think through those stories, what it means to be human, that machines also might be in a position to, again, through their direct understanding and through their reading of the signals from an individual, to provide a kind of moral education as well. What are the positive aspects of such a development, but also what are some of the negative aspects of such a development from the point of view, say, of the Confucian, Christian, and Taoist traditions? So maybe, Sorhun, you could start.
Well, my institution is very much into technology-enhanced education. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. For example, when you have blended learning, it enables students to learn at their own pace, right? They are not just trapped in the classroom where they either get it or they don't when you lecture and things like that. But I think here there's also a limit, in the sense that we should think of AI as complementary aids rather than competitive, right? I don't think we have quite got to the stage where we can just have AI as personalized tutor and we do away with all teachers, all human teachers. The reason being this, in the sense that even if you can monitor every aspect of a student, right, their reaction to course content, to see whether they are actually progressing in their understanding or accumulation of knowledge, etc., etc., the number of parameters that are relevant is potentially infinite. And which of these facts or things that you're monitoring about the students is relevant in terms of what you need to do to help the students progress, may be difficult to translate or be handled by an algorithm. Right? Now, of course, with the kind of processing power that AI has, it could deal with millions of parameters at the same time. But it's actually still not very reliable. It is prone to wild mistakes. Okay, even in areas where it seems to have achieved a great deal of success in terms of accuracy, for example, face recognition, right? Its accuracy is much higher than human ability to recognize images. But when it does make a mistake, the mistakes are totally inexplicable and wildly off, right? But that may be just a matter of the state of the technology. But I do think that in terms of the education process, when we aim for what we call transformative education, for example, right? When does a student actually achieve that kind of transformation, right? It's not so much to do with the course content or even how well you monitor their progress. It's really to do with the teacher's ability to connect with the student at the level where your attention to their particular personality, their circumstances, pick out the appropriate relevant factors about them. And what you picked out as relevant is as much dependent on your own particular experience as a teacher, right? Your own past experience, your own personality, which means different teachers encountering the same students will find different things appropriate, right? So the transformation that result, in fact, will be different because when you have a different pairing, okay, the same student, different teachers, the transformative result is different. Different students, same teacher, you also have different transformative results. Right? And this is the kind of flexibility and uniqueness, if you like, to the transformative process that I think insofar as insofar as AI is limited to algorithmic systems, cannot really achieve.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Paul?
I think in our discussions, when we talked about this, somebody made a distinction that I thought was very helpful, where they said maybe AI could be there for the instructional dimension, and that teaching or education in the broader sense is something more than just the passing on of knowledge and being able to help a person to evaluate. I think in the older notion of education, it's also about the person who can draw out of the person. And for me, maybe I'm stuck with magical thinking, but I like to think really good teaching is also involving an interaction of two people. I taught for many years in a teacher training college, and we were training people to be teachers and evaluating them as teachers. And I actually became very some were born to be teachers, others were not going to be teachers. I'm sorry to say that, but it's one of the reasons I gave up working in that college, because I just couldn't believe that we were actually forming teachers. I suppose the other thing I will say on the education thing, I do think we do need to look at educationally, though, is already, before we get near AI, the volume of information that young people, and not just young, have at their fingertips means that the role of the teacher is not so much any longer to be the dispenser or the gatekeeper of knowledge, but is to be the guide and the mentor. And above all, we need to teach people that sense of judgment and methods of judgment. And I think there are far more important human tasks we need to get right about education first. That would be my own instinct.
So I actually, in this discussion, I made a distinction between instructor and the teacher, instruction and the teaching. So I think AI doing the best, very effectively instructing someone, give someone, input, then probably output. So it's good to give you the directions, but it's efficient instructor, but a lousy teacher. So why we see that because the teaching required much more than simply instruction, because the teaching is mutually learning experience, teachers and the student. Let's take the martial arts. Let's take it's how Taoist teaching in a work is masters and the disciples. They are not just transmitting skill, but they also transforming heart and mind, right? So in the one hand, if you remember Karate Kid and the new one, so I was a cultural consultant for that film. So you can see Jackie Chan is teaching Jay to learning all these fancy kung fu moves. But at the same time, Jake actually transformed Jackie Chan. In other words, Jake helped Jackie Chan realize his own weakness. That means a student help a teacher to transform. So in this kind of set, in this kind of context, I don't think AI can do so.
Yeah, I mean, teaching is not just the transmission of information. It's really important to remember, as was said, it involves an emotional connection between teacher and student, and the teacher sets a positive example, ideally, to the student. I mean, just if I think of my favorite teachers in primary school, in secondary school, in university, I can remember which ones I liked and which ones I didn't like, but I cannot remember what information they transmitted, right? I mean, it's like reading a novel. I can remember if I liked the novel, but I can't really remember the plot, right? So it's key to remember that, you know, AI is ultimately more about transmitting information, and it can't replace this important role of the teacher. So yeah, of course, AI can complement the role of teaching, but it should never replace. That said, it's worth keeping in mind that this is the ideal model of teaching is small class, small interaction between teacher and student, maybe complemented by AI, but that's also very expensive, right? I mean, think of liberal arts education in the US. I mean, it's very expensive, and most of the world doesn't have the luxury to do that. So maybe AI can be very helpful, like as a second best possibility for very poor places, you know, that where you can't afford small classes, and maybe their AI can have and should have a more prominent role in the educational system. Yeah.
Great.
I just think of my university, Shandong University, which is a very good university, but we can't afford small classes much of the time. It's just unfortunate. I'm dean. I want to encourage it. We just don't have the resources. So yeah.
So maybe before opening it up, one more concrete example of an emerging technology which is raising issues that have to do with human-machine interaction. I'm thinking of something Sohun mentioned, elderly care, where one could argue that the evolution of smart robots that attend to physical needs, perhaps, around the house or around the apartment, but also increasingly become conversation partners that personalize their interaction with an elderly person, maybe in the absence of human beings to provide that care. What do you see against the background of your traditions as the positive developments there, the potentials, but also some of the dangers for the human person?
I think in older societies, when people grow old and if they actually need care, let's say they lose some of their functionalities, there is no option other than their family members taking care of them. But in modern living, we are already dependent on a lot of external help, right? In fact, there's a huge demand for care professionals, both institutionalized but also home care kind of care professionals. So insofar as this has become almost an inevitable need, right? I think AI has a lot of potential to relieve some of the pressure on certain societies where there's a huge labor shortage. So there's a shortage of care professionals who are needed. But from the Confucian perspective, I would be again concerned about whether we are edging from using AI as a complementary aid into allowing it to become a competitive kind of option, in the sense that it might be too easy for, children, for example, right, to see it as an easy substitute instead of themselves caring for their parents, right? That's not to say that children are necessarily the best carers, right? We are all imperfect, and sometimes children, no matter how much they love their parents, they don't do the caring very well. So to the extent, help is always appreciated and should be appreciated. But I think one should not underestimate the need for that, nevertheless, the need to actually do whatever you can in terms of certainly fulfilling your filial responsibility, in the sense that it matters both to the children, because it's part of, for Confucians at least, it's part of their own personal growth, that no matter how inadequate they might be as carers, the effort, right, makes a difference. And I think even from the parents' perspective, sometimes it's not so much that you want the perfect care in terms of someone who can make you comfortable, take care of your physical need in the most perfect way possible, but rather it's the companionship, right? Because they are your children, you have a certain interest in them. You want to hear about what's going on in their life. You want them to share with you their joys, their frustrations, their troubles, etc., right? Because maintaining that bond is much more important to them sometimes, even than having their physical needs cared for. So there again, I think as complementary aid, AI is good, but as competitive option, I would say we have to be careful there.
Daniel, on the Confucian tradition, would you add anything?
Well, I have a very similar view, but just to illustrate it with a concrete case. I mean, especially in East Asia, many cute robots are being developed for purposes of caring for elderly parents, and that's good if it could complement the normal caring functions that adult children would have towards their elderly parents. But there's a risk that is actually not just purely hypothetical, that the elderly parents would become more attached to the cute robots than to their own children. And so we need to combat that risk. So if it were a matter of policy in an East Asian society that values filial piety, I would favor designing ugly robots that decrease the likelihood that they would replace the love between children and elderly parents.
Okay, well, we've got a half an hour for questions and answers, which Father Dorian will guide from the podium.
So on my bedside table is a book called The Idiot's Guide to AI, and I need it. It says this, that an informal definition of an algorithm could be a set of rules that precisely defines a sequence of operations, which generally includes all computer programs, and it says generally a program is only an algorithm if it stops eventually. So in your questions, I'd like you to be an algorithm. Which is to say that in order to have a chi-like flow in our conversation, could you please ask a question, and politely I'm asking you to ask it concisely so that everybody else we can enrich the conversation with many voices. So I'm put my teacher's hat on, first of all, thank you. And I'm gonna ask you to pause for, let's say, 1 minute in silence as you begin to formulate your question. Thank you very much. Put there. Thank you. We'll take the mic, we'll bring you a mic.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentations. My name is Irina Raiko. I'm the director of the Internet Ethics Program at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics here on campus. And I was struck by the conversation around education in particular because today tech ethicists were having an interesting conversation on Twitter about the deployment of AI in some schools in China where they're using facial recognition and emotion recognition and the revulsion of the students against this and them having no choice. So I wanted to ask, you were very modest in talking about how you don't want to posit sort of an ideal model of teaching that doesn't really exist. But don't we have to be careful to not posit an ideal model of AI that doesn't exist also?
Thank you.
Daniel, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, to be frank, I don't know enough about this case to comment. But I guess you're suggesting that we should avoid uses of AI in educational settings that lead to negative consequences, right? I mean, I could just think I could just abstractly, facial recognition in classrooms, it can be put to use for good or bad purposes. I mean, if it's put to use to capture people who are sleeping during the talks, for example, that might be a good, although they have jet lag, so that's perfectly understandable. But seriously, if there's students who consistently fall asleep in class, I mean, and this might be a good way of alerting the teacher to a problem, right? I mean, that's not something wrong with that. But if it's put to use for purposes for negative purpose, I mean, in what way is it negative in this case?
In the ways that surveillance societies destroy intellectual freedom and creativity and everything that comes from feeling like you're watched all the time, and that decisions would be made about you based on algorithms that are often completely wrong, as you were saying, sometimes just wildly inaccurate. And
sure. I mean, if it leads to misjudgments and takes away people's creativity, obviously it's a bad thing. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, yes, this right at the back there.
Hi, I'm Jeff Klaben. I teach in the Engineering Law and Business School here at Santa Clara. I was intrigued by the discussion on the difference between instruction and teaching, interactive, experiential. If I want to design a new course, which we've been experimenting with, to focus on the latter, what models would you point towards? If I proposed a new syllabus that was purely based on interaction without much instruction, that probably wouldn't fly well here. But just your thoughts on what hurdles to overcome and how to move in that direction.
I guess you have to start with what's your course objective, right? I mean, what are you actually trying to teach? Then how much of it should be instructional and how much of it should be more than just instructional? Because usually for any kind of course, there is a certain element that is instructional. Because for one thing, there has to be some content, and you need to consider the best way to deliver that content. And some of these methods of delivery might just be instructional. But beyond that, I think for any kind of courses that go beyond just that kind of basic instruction would be where you enter into the kind of pedagogy where it requires much more doing. The students need to learn by doing. And in learning by doing, this is where you can no longer just rely on instruction. Because when you allow your students to learn something through doing, you have to be prepared for the unexpected. You have to expect that each of them will do whatever. You set a kind of a rough activity and say, okay, you are supposed to do this. And you have in mind they are supposed to learn something. But when they start doing what you tell them to do, they will all do it in their own way. And they will not necessarily end up what you think they are going to learn. In fact, they may show you something about what you thought you want to teach them, but in fact, you yourself did not understand it fully, because through there are different ways of trying to carry out your instructions in a way. They open up new vistas, right? So they learn, but you also learn through what they are learning, right? So this is the part where then the interactivity in terms of teaching, where you as a teacher with a particular kind of experience, but also your own particular limitations, right? Encounter the student as a particular kind of learner, right? Doing a certain kind of activity. And then the process is transformative for both parties, I think. I don't know.
And I also see research has shows students really learn from teachers they love. So it's really, it's data-driven research has shown this. So I'm not sure, of course, and engineering is very different than philosophy, right? So, but I do think there's two, from teachers' part, do you care about your student, right? Do you care about student? Do you want them inspired to learn, or do you want them in your class, just come to your class just for the sake of getting grades? So I think that for the teacher part, you do want to see how do I inspire student, and particularly inspire students' heart and mind. Let them really love this course and also love this profession in the long run. So, but at the same time, I do think that all these years teaching, I'm really happy when I see students ask me question. I said, come on, ask me a question, make me smart. Otherwise, I look like, right? So student question make us smart and inspired us as well. So it's a mutual process.
I was teaching for many years, and one of the things that I suppose I became to realize is as a teacher, I was responsible not just for the transmission, for what I was putting out there, but for the reception, for what was happening with the student. And I suppose the hard way of that was the first time I ever had to correct examination papers, where there was an incentive for people to accurately repeat what you had said to them. And you realize that this was rather, it began by faulting them, the students, and then I realized, no, it's me, because I'd happened enough understanding of the filters through which they're hearing, so you become more corrective. I think the other thing as a teacher, the great moment is you introduce people to a subject and you may get them fired up and interested in the subject, and they will come back afterwards and revisit the material and take it further and correct, in fact, what you were doing. So there's that openness to the process that you're learning together that I think is interesting.
This gentleman here. Wait for the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. So first, I want to put some comments to my 2 cents, and then I have a few questions. So
How about you made one question?
okay, I
Thank
will
you.
make one question. And first is, what is good education? I think it's effective and efficient. And we need good teachers. There is no bad student, right? And then we need teacher to match with the student. And then we need to have more information about the student, like the emotional and other background. And we need more caring. We also need more informative, like how he is learning. And then we can impose we can do adaptive learning, which is inspired from game. And there's a very good institute doing it. It's called 42 in the Bay Area. And I think the inspiration I have is that it starts from easy, and then slowly it goes to hard. It's adaptive. And then it visualizes the purpose and rewards. So the student has a control. He knows what he wants, and he can control. He knows how fast he should run. And it's also interactive, and yeah. So the fundamental thing is that we need more content. Can we let teachers to connect with teachers so that they can share their lectures, they can share how they are teaching, and how to modularize the knowledge? And my question is that, what is learning? Why do we need to learn? What should we learn? So this is not the real question. The real question is, after all these things, is how do we learn important? So a little bit background. My name is Dong Mingjing. I am a PhD in astrophysics, and I'm now running a startup trying to solve this.
Well, first, I want to draw some boundaries. So I will say, if I am your teacher, but I'm not your mother. So I can't know all about you. I don't really want to know about you either, right? So that drawing I say I do. I talk about the care, but it's intellectual care. So that's the one thing. Well, for your question about the learning, well, learning is a way of living. Do you want to live? So then you learn, right? So for Confucius has a saying, you learn 学到老，活到老，学到老, right? You're living to the death, or you live up to your death, old age, and then you're learning up to your old age. So same. So living itself, life itself is a learning process.
Thank you. There was a lady here. Hannah, may I? This lady here in the middle.
Hi, my name is Catherine Harris, and I'm a professor at San Jose State University, which is a mere 4 miles away from here. And I do work in digital humanities and deep humanities. And I'm so glad that this was an open forum and that I could come and listen to you, because I was really struck by the optimism of the entire panel in the aspect of humanity and AI, and the sense that the theme is more about how to improve or evolve AI, humanity in the face of AI. And I'm wondering if all the panelists can see a thread about this optimism, and where do we go from here, not just in education, but all over the world, and thinking about our daily lives and our daily movements, and how we can possibly teach those boundaries to our students of all sorts and ranks at all different kinds of universities.
I'm not sure that we are optimistic. I mean, I think pretty much over the past couple of days, we're all aware and worry about misuses. I mean, in a capitalist system, the main danger is that AI would be used to increase profits of capitalists as opposed to helping the majority of people, and that's serious risk in education as well. And in China, there are different kinds of risks as well that were pointed. It could be used to promote more control and decrease creativity. So I'm not sure that we're optimistic. I mean, but we have to think of what standards. All we can do is, as intellectuals, is provide more clarity about the standards we should employ to think of what counts as progress and regress, and whether we could persuade capitalists or government leaders. I mean, I'm not sure. That's not our task, right?
Could I ask a follow-up and ask Paul, you mentioned that Catholic social thought and Pope Francis have not come to any definitive conclusions about AI, which is wise as it's an evolving topic. At the same time, the mixture of positive and negative, how do you see that in the Pope's own thinking about artificial intelligence? And can you lay out for us some of the key issues that are being debated in these circles about where the church should come down on these questions?
Maybe if I go back to reflect on some of the early thinking that was done about digital culture in general and the emergence of digitalization and social media and all of that sort of stuff. One of the things I think we were the headline, "The Vatican condemns," is too easy. We have to avoid that. I think we have to avoid that automatic sense that we're somehow going to be on the negative, and it's trying to understand, observe, get a better appreciation of what we're talking about. And I think for a lot of the stuff, some of what we're talking about artificial intelligence, there are real applications and development we can comment about. Some of it is highly speculative. And while it's interesting to speculate and it forces us to think through some of our categories, I think we would not want to be definitive on anything like that yet. I think the other thing we have to be very conscious of is that we're part of a tradition that recognizes that one of the gifts we have is we have a capacity for reason and to reflect. And as Antonio mentioned today, but Benedict had this notion that technology shows the capacity of the spirit, in a sense, to advance the material, that we live as human beings with that openness towards development. And I think we have to keep that alert. I think also that's important that if we come across as somehow negative on science, negative on technology, negative on all of that, then we won't be able to have the dialogue that will be necessary when we ask, well, to what purposes are we putting these developments? Is what seems to be progressive really progressive in terms of its benefits and what it produces for humanity? So, but I do think we have to be careful to appreciate the advances. I think anything that somehow adds more intelligence in the broadest sense to our human resources is to be welcomed. We then need to think through that more critically, what we mean by intelligence. And I think one of the interesting things is that all of this is making us do is reflect more critically on what it is to be human, what it is that is distinctively human, that makes life worthwhile, and to become more critical about the processes we use.
Kirti here.
Professor Kirti Kalyanam. I'm in the business school. I'm a marketing professor, so I'm responsible for studying social media, these kind of very bad things. I have a more broader philosophical question. As an economist, or partially trained as an economist, I see this as another technological revolution. And there have been other technological revolutions that we have faced, the steam engine, the electricity, locomotives, et cetera, and even more devastating ones like the invention of nuclear technology and power. Why is this different, and how is it different, and how did humanity cope with those changes, and were they good or were they bad? A very broad question, but I appreciate any thoughts you have.
Maybe I'll offer, is this on? Can you hear me? This is a key issue, right? Whenever a new technology comes along, there are the doomsayers, the optimists, and somehow we adjust, and the fundamental questions of what it means to be human aren't necessarily reposed or reformed. I think there's a difference, though. You could track revolutions in information, communications, transportation technology over the last 100 years, and you see a trend toward greater communication across distance, less time in face-to-face human interaction. But maybe we're at an inflection point where machines are becoming and will become so ubiquitous. Think about virtual reality, which is now in its very early stages, but is a technology which will allow people to immerse themselves in real worlds, have real experiences that are not mediated by person-to-person fleshly encounters. I mean, that is something radically new. We already see it with the gaming revolution. It's going to go further. And a lot of those worlds will be generated by artificial intelligence, which is responding to our own preferences, desires, trying to shape our preferences and desires in ways that none of these earlier technologies could have. So that would be my sense of what is most revolutionary about this moment and what makes it different from the earlier revolutions.
Can I add very quickly? I think last revolutions, China is not a part of it. But today, this revolution, China is part of it. And China in some ways leads the way. So we do need to understand China and also the world.
Thank you. First, I'd like to say thank you to the panelists for a rich discussion. I'm Mei Lin Chin. I'm in the philosophy department here at Santa Clara University, and so I too am going to give a philosophical question. My question is directed towards Sorhun Tan and Robin Wong, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how intelligence is construed in the Confucian and Taoist traditions, respectively, because one of the things that I heard coming out of this discussion is there's a sort of deep suspicion that AI will ever be able to really model human intelligence because it's algorithm-based. And so something that's algorithm-based is always going to be a little bit too automatic. As responsive as AI can be, it's still a little too automatic. But I also know that in both the Confucian and Taoist tradition, one of the aims of cultivation is a kind of automatic responsiveness, maybe in a more social way, right? But there's a kind of valorization of automaticity in a sense. And I was wondering if you could, because I know the question of what intelligence is in these two traditions is really broad, but maybe could you speak to the question of what intelligence is in terms of automaticity and skill? Yeah.
So intelligence is very complicated, so you ask really big questions. So, but here I give you more specific directly to answer because the time is in the concern. So I think Taoist intelligence, one way I can look at it called embodied wisdom. This embodied wisdom, what that it is, what it look like, how do you manifest it? This will be one of it's called territory. The riding horses. Riding horses is one of a Chinese classical liberal education, because riding horse, you have many different circumstances, the weather, the terrain, and the horse's temperament, and your goal, and your emotional makeups. So in this thing, you need to navigate all these elements working together and then finish your journey. Because the horse has a temperament. You want the horse go fast, they go slow. You want to go slow, then you go fast, right? You also have a goal, and also you have your own emotional, state of being. So intelligence will manifest in this horse riding. And that is if you can efficiently doing so, and then I will see this person possess this embodied wisdom. This is how Taoists think about the intelligence. And then I will say, use another word to say maybe it's art of adaptivity.
I think intelligence as a concept is a fairly modern kind of understanding. So therefore AI, the intelligence that they are talking about is our modern understanding of intelligence. But if you look at the ancient traditions, right? I mean, for Confucians, I think we can retrospectively see a distinction between knowledge and wisdom. And what they're interested in is wisdom. So you know what is now the term that is usually translated as knowledge or even intelligence, right? 知 or 智. Right, in the ancient, in the classical language, right, certainly for the Confucians, it's not knowledge in the sense of propositional knowledge. Right? It's actually a virtue. And what does it mean for it to be a virtue? Of course, you might think that then this is a virtue in the sense of maybe Phronesis or Sophia and all that. But I think it's a virtue. What needs emphasizing here is that As a virtue, is much more about judgment than about reasoning, right? Because reasoning, certainly, if you think that reasoning can be turned into an algorithm, you're thinking about a reasoning where logic is very important. It's basically logical reasoning, right? There has to be some kind of logic to it. But the kind of thinking or the kind of virtue, right, that constitute 知 for the Confucians is not logic-based. It's actually a kind of valorized and valorizing perception and also judgment, right? A kind of virtuous judgment, right? So if that's the case, it's not so much automaticity, right? I would rather call it a kind of spontaneous efficacy. In any kind of situation, you can, not just through your logical mind, but actually all the whatever perceptual, and perhaps there's also some intuitive process going on. It means whatever it is that you are receiving from the environment, from what you observe, from other kinds of moral sense or moral sensibility, you can make a decision of, or you can respond through action that is completely appropriate, right? So, but this process, right, this reception of moral sensing and response has very little to do with logic. You can't turn it into a set of logical rules and say that if you were to apply these logical rules, you can behave as virtuously as the sage.
Thank you. Is that right at the back?
Thank you for that very rich conversation. I'm also from San Jose State, from the literature department, and my colleague asked the question about optimism earlier on. So I just wanted to share with you all, we actually at San Jose State organized a symposium on deep humanities and AI last year, using the Frankenstein novel as a kind of a springboard. And when discussing the novel, usually the discussions around AI center around questions about human-centered design, human rights approaches, and so on. But the novel sort of pushed us to ask questions about what about the rights of the creature, of the AI machine? What kind of ethical responsibilities will we owe to the creature that we create? And the comment earlier made about maybe we should create ugly robots that we can hate. The whole novel is really about the creature asking for love from his creator. And the refusal of that love turns him into a monster. So in the light of the discussion around rethinking the human in more dispersed, more relational ways, how would you all respond to this question of what obligations and ethical responsibilities would we have to an AI creature that we create?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to say that we should hate the ugly robots. I just mean to say that we should design robots that do the work efficiently, but that won't lead, elderly parents to become too attached to them. But I don't quite see that there's any rights or obligations that we owe to AI as it stands now, unless AI develops feelings or consciousness. I mean, they're just tools. Just like, I don't owe any obligation to this bottle of water or to a kind of hammer. I mean, they're there to serve us. That's it, I mean, we shouldn't, it's bad maybe if I take a chair and just smash it, but it reflects badly on me, but it's not because I owe obligations to the chair, right? I mean, maybe I'm missing something.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. I'd like to yield this question to a student, since we are a university. So, there.
Good. Hi, thank you. My name is Julian Dryman. I'm a sophomore here. Professor Bell, when you asked at the beginning of the talk, do we want to see a future where we don't have to have hard work or strenuous labor? I raised my hand too, as many of us in this room did. But I wonder, to the panel, reflecting on your faith traditions and what you study, is it possible for AI to make life too easy? You said that Confucianism is about personhood and how personhood must be created. Is it possible that if we make life too easy, then are we losing part of our personhood in that struggle?
I should say that's an excellent question. We talked about it at some length. It's a fascinating question. Who'd like to jump in on that?
I don't think it's a question of making life too easy, because what Daniel is talking about is all those boring, repetitive. In some ways, what Marx is talking about is the kind of dehumanizing labor, right? The kind of labor that results in alienation, etc., etc. But in the utopia that he's talking about, I don't think it needs to be one where hard work is no longer present, but it's hard work that you voluntarily engage in, because it's hard work that actually develops your humanity, right? And Confucians would certainly say, well, you still have to cultivate yourself, and cultivating yourself is very hard work, okay? But it's work that you cannot try to avoid. And a lot of this hard work has to do with improving your relationship with people, okay? As someone in our discussion also say, one of the attraction of iPhones, gadgets, using all this, whether it's virtual reality or just communicating with people through this mediation of technology, so that you don't have to hear their nagging or see their unhappy faces. Now, all these things, Confucians will say you can't avoid. It is hard work. It is sometimes very unpleasant learning process that you go through. But it's absolutely crucial to self-cultivation and becoming the human person that you are meant to be.
I think it's not a matter of, like, say, make life easy. Rather, if lost the ability, if you lost the human ability, then Taoist perspective will question about this, because there is certain human ability, and we need to preserve, cultivate, and, for example, curiosity. If you because you have AI help you everything, and then you lost the basic curiosity about the world, and then you're not living in this world, then that's a problem. So we want to protecting human ability.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, think of GPS. I mean, it makes life easier, which is good. But on the other hand, if it means that young people lose a sense of orientation that the elders have, that's not necessarily a good thing either, right?
Yeah, I was reluctant to put my hand up to the utopian. I think I had remembrance of a bad episode of Star Trek where they arrive on this perfect planet and suddenly it's not quite as... But on a more serious level, I think as I begin more critical about it, I probably don't have to do most of the time the hard and dangerous manual type works that could be abolished. But I think the kind of work that we might be opening up towards to be more creative, to be more engaging into, is also requires effort. So therefore, I don't think effort disappears, but maybe some of the drudgery, and I think that's one of the things that when I've been thinking about some of the work that will be displaced, some of that work is dangerous, some of that work is so, the person is drawing on they're not drawing on their full humanity in that. So I think we do need, I think work is also, and I think this is where it's important that we have some sort of work is not just what produces economic benefit for me, it's where I find my identity, it's where I socialize. So, and I think that we'll be thinking of context, but I think struggle is what makes life, it's achievement, it's struggle. There's another literary reference here is Julian Barnes, British novelist, final chapter of A History of the World in 10.5 chapters, is this ideal world where everything starts is going right, but it's boredom before long. We need challenge, we need exit, yeah.
Gentlemen and ladies, I'd like you to join me in congratulating and thanking our panelists.